The shared water gourd caught the first rays of dawn light, its simple form holding reflections of sky and hope in equal measure. The feathered prayer stick took shape in Aiyana's careful hands as the sun painted the morning sky in shades of pink and gold. Mary watched from her sleeping area, fascinated by the precision with which he wrapped each feather, tied each knot, and whispered words in his native tongue that she couldn't understand but somehow felt in her heart. She had observed this morning ritual for 3 days now, noting how Aiyana's entire demeanor changed during its creation. The wariness that never fully left his expression softened into something approaching peace. His movements became ceremonial, reverent, as if he were handling sacred objects that connected him to purposes larger than simple survival. "May I ask what you're making?" Mary ventured, uncertain whether curiosity might intrude on something deeply private. Aiyana looked up from his weaving, his hands pausing in their careful work. For a moment she thought he might refuse to explain, maintaining the boundary between their practical partnership and his spiritual life. Then his expression opened, inviting her into understanding she hadn't expected to receive. "Prayer stick for your husband and son," he said quietly. "In my people's way, when someone die violent death, their spirits sometimes cannot find peace. This helped them know they honored, remembered, helped them find path to ancestors in spirit world." The explanation struck Mary with unexpected emotion. This Apache warrior, exiled from his own people, was creating sacred objects to honor her Presbyterian family, bridging spiritual traditions that his culture and hers had never thought to connect. "You would do that for them, for us." Aiyana resumed his careful weaving, choosing his English words with the same precision he applied to the feathers and leather strands. "Your husband, your boy, they die defending home, protecting what they love. That kind of death, Apache honor, same as white man honor. Brave spirits deserve proper sending to next world." Mary felt tears gathering, not the desperate grief that had consumed her since the raid, but something gentler and more healing. "What should I do? How can I help? You tell me about them. Their names, what they love in life, what make them happy. I put those things in prayer, so spirits remember joy, not just dying." The invitation to speak about Thomas and Daniel felt like an unexpected gift. Since the raid, Mary had avoided dwelling on memories that brought only pain. Now Aiyana offered her the chance to transform those memories into celebration rather than torment. "Thomas," she began slowly, "loved working with his hands, building things that would last beyond his own lifetime. He used to say that every piece of wood had its perfect use, if you took time to understand its grain and character." Aiyana nodded, adding a small piece of oak to his bundle, wood from the tree where Thomas now rested, and Daniel was fascinated by horses, wild ones mostly. He would stand at our fence for hours watching them graze in the distance, making up stories about where they came from and what adventures they'd had. A hawk feather joined the oak, representing freedom and wild spirits that couldn't be tamed by human expectations or limitations. "They loved each other deeply," Mary continued, finding unexpected comfort in sharing these treasures. "Thomas would carry Daniel on his shoulders when they walked the property together, showing him how to read animal tracks and identify plants we could eat if times got hard. Daniel absorbed every lesson like he was storing wisdom for his own future adventures." The completed prayer stick bore elements representing both Apache traditions and personal remembrance: feathers for spiritual journey, sacred herbs for blessing, wooden elements connecting to earth and growing things. Aiyana held it up to catch the morning light, then walked toward the graves where Thomas and Daniel rested. Mary followed, watching as he placed the prayer stick between their resting places and spoke words in Apache that flowed like poetry, like water, over stones, like wind through canyon walls. She didn't understand the language, but she felt the reverence and intention flowing from his ritual toward the two people she had loved most in the world. When he finished, Aiyana turned to her with an expression both gentle and strong. "Now we speak together. You say goodbye words that help them know you remember love, not just loss. Standing between the graves with this unlikely spiritual guide, Mary found herself speaking directly to Thomas and Daniel for the first time since their deaths. The words came haltingly at first, then with increasing fluidity as grief transformed into grateful remembrance. Thomas, I'm going to finish building our home. I'm going to make it strong and beautiful, the way you taught me to make everything we touched together. Daniel, I'm going to remember your stories about the wild horses and tell them to other children someday, so your imagination lives on in their dreams. The morning ritual concluded, with both of them standing quietly beside the graves, while dawn light gathered strength around them. Mary felt something shift inside her chest, not the absence of grief, but the presence of something else alongside it. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of hope returning to her wounded heart. Thank you, she said to Aiyana, for honoring them, for helping me remember joy instead of just pain. Aiyana nodded, understanding flowing between them that didn't require translation into either of their languages. Grief is love, with no place to go. Prayer stick, give grief a place, so love can stay in your heart without so much hurting. They returned to construction work with spirits that felt lighter, despite the physical demands ahead. The second course of logs required lifting timbers that tested both their strength and their coordination. Mary found herself relying on Aiyana's steady presence more completely, trusting his judgment about balance and leverage in ways that felt both practical and symbolic. Together, he would say when they approached each heavy lift, count to 3, then raise as one person with 4 arms. Their synchronization improved throughout the day, movements becoming more fluid as they learned each other's rhythm and capabilities. Mary discovered muscles she hadn't used since helping Thomas with barn construction 2 summers ago, strength that had been dormant but not lost during months of domestic routine that preceded the raid. By evening, they had completed the second log course around 3 walls, with the 4th wall requiring additional planning to accommodate the door and windows that would make their structure truly livable, rather than merely functional. Tomorrow we plan openings, Aiyana explained as they shared their simple dinner. Door must be strong, but also welcoming. Windows must bring light, but also keep out cold wind when winter storms come. Mary studied their emerging walls by firelight, trying to envision the completed structure and the life it might shelter through the harsh months ahead. What will you do when we finish? Where will you go then? The question had been growing in her mind as their partnership deepened and completion approached. Aiyana's exile seemed to preclude any permanent settlement, yet his investment in their construction project suggested attachment that went beyond temporary convenience or simple survival needs. Aiyana considered her question with the careful attention he brought to all personal matters. I think maybe I stay in mountains for winter, find cave or build small shelter where no soldiers come looking for Apache to kill. In spring, he shrugged. Spring very far away still. His answer carried loneliness that Mary recognized in her own future plans. They were both building toward solitude, creating shelter that would protect them from weather, but not from the isolation that circumstances had imposed on their lives. The house will be large enough for 2 people, she said quietly, testing words that felt both natural and impossible. Aiyana met her gaze across the fire, understanding the invitation implicit in her observation while recognizing the complications such an arrangement would create for both of them. White woman who help Apache man both face danger from white soldiers and from Apache war parties. Neither world accepts such partnership when people discover what we do here. But we're already partners, Mary pointed out reasonably. We've been living and working together for weeks now. If we can build a house together, why couldn't we share it through the winter? The question hung between them like a bridge spanning territory neither had expected to explore when their partnership began. Both understood the implications, practical, social and personal, of such an arrangement extending beyond the construction project that had brought them together. Mary Caldwell, Aiyana said carefully, You think now about surviving winter cold. But spring bring different questions, different choices. Better we build good house, help you live through hard season, then see what spring reveal about best path forward. His wisdom acknowledged both the appeal of their partnership and the complexity of sustaining it beyond immediate necessity. Mary felt both disappointment and relief at his measured response, recognizing that rushing toward permanent arrangements might complicate the friendship they had built through careful patience and mutual respect. As they prepared for sleep, the prayer stick stood silently between Thomas and Daniel's graves, blessing their rest and somehow blessing the unlikely partnership that continued building hope from the ashes of tragedy. The feathers stirred in the night wind, carrying prayers toward stars that watched over both Apache and white dreams with equal indifference and equal possibility. The cornerstone ceremony occurred at sunrise on their 15th day of partnership, with frost painting the desert silver and their breath visible in the thin mountain air. Mary held Thomas's hammer, while Aiyana positioned the carefully selected stone that would anchor their house's southeast corner, the direction from which light and warmth would enter their home during the dark months ahead. This stone, Aiyana explained, it carried prayers from both our traditions, your Christian God and my Apache spirits. They both want people to have safe shelter when winter winds blow cold and fierce. Mary raised the hammer, feeling the weight of the moment as much as the tool's familiar heft in her hands. This cornerstone would outlast both of them, marking the spot where two broken people had chosen to build hope from the ruins of their former lives. The hammer struck true, seating the stone firmly in its bed of mortar. Aiyana spoke a blessing in Apache, while Mary offered her own silent prayer of gratitude for second chances and unexpected friendships. Their house had truly begun, rising from foundation stones toward walls that would shelter dreams. Neither had dared imagine when they first met beside the graves of her destroyed family. The construction process had evolved into a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial in its precision. Each morning began with assessment of the previous day's work and planning for the challenges ahead. Aiyana's building knowledge proved more sophisticated than Mary had initially realized. He understood not just how to raise walls, but how to integrate multiple traditions of architecture into structures that honored both function and beauty. Apache build for the land, he explained, as they worked on the foundation's final course. House should grow from earth like tree or flower, not fight against wind and water and stone. Your husband's design good, because he sees same thing, how to work with desert, not against it. Mary studied their emerging foundation with new appreciation for Thomas's original vision. He had indeed chosen this site for its natural drainage, wind protection, and solar orientation that would provide warmth during winter months and shade during summer heat. Now Aiyana was helping her enhance that vision with techniques that made the structure more integrated with its desert environment. The walls began rising with surprising speed. Once they established their working rhythm, Aiyana's strength proved invaluable for lifting heavy logs into position. But Mary's growing skill at notching and fitting meant she could prepare materials as quickly as he could set them in place.
You have good hands for this work, Aiyana observed, as Mary completed a particularly complex joint. Your husband teach you well, but you also have natural feeling for how wood wants to be shaped. The compliment warmed Mary in ways that went beyond pride in developing craftsmanship. She had begun to discover aspects of herself that marriage and motherhood had left unexplored. Working beside Aiyana awakened capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, strengths that had been dormant but not absent during her years of domestic routine. By midday they had raised 3 complete courses of logs, creating walls that reached Mary's chest height. The structure was beginning to look like an actual house, rather than an experiment in cross-cultural cooperation. Standing inside the wall perimeter, Mary could envision the completed interior, fireplace warming the main room, kitchen area, organized for efficient food preparation,
sleeping alcove positioned for privacy and comfort during the long winter nights ahead. "What do you think?" she asked Aiyana, gesturing toward their morning's progress. Aiyana walked the interior perimeter, testing joints and checking the wall's vertical alignment with careful attention to details that would determine the structure's long-term stability and weather resistance. "Good work," he pronounced finally. "Strong walls, tight joints. This house protect you through many winters, maybe outlast both of us if built with proper care." His use of singular pronouns struck Mary with unexpected sadness. Throughout their partnership, they had spoken of our work and our house, but Aiyana consistently referred to Mary's future in individual terms, as if his own residence there remained temporary at best. "Where will you spend winter if not here?" she asked directly, testing his assumptions about their shared future. Aiyana paused in his inspection, considering how much truth their partnership could sustain without creating complications neither was prepared to handle. "Apache who live among white people face danger from all sides," he said finally. "Your neighbors, they see Indian man with white woman. They think I force you to help me hide from soldiers. My people, they see me with whites. They think I betray Apache ways for white man's comfort and safety." Mary understood the logic of his concerns while rejecting their inevitability. "What if we don't tell anyone? What if we simply live here quietly and let people make their own assumptions about how I survived the winter alone?" Secrets in territory like this, they're hard to keep when people start asking questions. Someone sees smoke from chimney. They come to investigate why widow woman didn't freeze to death. They find Apache man and white woman living together. They jump to conclusions that bring trouble for both of us. His practical assessment of their situation felt both wise and frustrating. Mary had begun to depend on Aiyana's presence, not just for construction assistance, but for companionship that eased the terrible loneliness of her widowhood. "I don't want to live alone," she admitted quietly. "I don't think I'm strong enough to manage that yet." Aiyana heard the vulnerability in her confession and chose his response carefully, balancing honesty with kindness. "Mary Caldwell, you stronger than you know. These weeks building together, they show me woman who can survive anything if she choose to fight for life instead of giving up to grief. But I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to live again. And living alone in this house we're building together doesn't feel like living. It feels like waiting to die with better walls around me." The honest exchange revealed depths of feeling that both had been avoiding since their partnership began. Mary's growing attachment to Aiyana extended beyond gratitude for his help or appreciation for his skills. She had begun to care for him as a person, to value his presence for its own sake, rather than merely a solution to practical problems. "We finish house first," Aiyana said diplomatically. "Then we see what winter bring, what choices seem possible when cold winds blow and survival become most important thing again." An unexpected early snowstorm arrived that evening, 3 weeks before such weather typically appeared in their part of Arizona territory. Mary woke to find their half-built house filled with swirling flakes, and Aiyana's sleeping area buried under several inches of snow that had blown through gaps in their incomplete walls. "Come," he said simply, gathering his blankets and moving toward the corner where Mary had established her sleeping space. "Tonight we share warmth, or we both freeze separately." The shared blanket represented crossing a line from friendship to something more intimate, though necessity rather than romance drove the decision. Mary found herself pressed against Aiyana's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of his body protecting her from the unseasonable cold that threatened to kill them both. Morning brought awkwardness along with clearing skies. They had awakened intertwined, Mary's head resting on Aiyana's shoulder and his arm curved protectively around her back. The intimacy felt both natural and dangerous, comfortable in ways that their separate sleeping arrangements had never achieved. The storm passed, Mary observed unnecessarily, avoiding direct discussion of their changed sleeping arrangements. "Yes," Aiyana agreed, also focusing on practical matters rather than personal implications. But early snow mean winter coming faster than we planned. Must work harder to finish walls and roof before next storm. They threw themselves into construction with renewed urgency, driven by the realization that survival depended on completing adequate shelter before winter weather made further building impossible. The shared blanket had awakened awareness of possibilities neither was quite ready to discuss openly, but which influenced every interaction throughout their intensified work schedule. Their efficiency improved dramatically as the deadline pressure forced them to streamline every aspect of the building process. Mary became more confident with heavy lifting, while Aiyana grew more patient with her questions and more generous with explanations of techniques she needed to master quickly. Together became their constant refrain as they approached each challenging task. Count to 3, then lift as one person. By the end of the week they had completed the walls and begun work on the roof structure that would determine whether their house provided adequate protection against the winter storms that were clearly approaching earlier than usual. The unseasonable weather had compressed their construction timeline, but it had also pushed their partnership toward intimacy that might not have developed under less desperate circumstances. The night of the roof-raising celebration, they sat before their fireplace in a house that was finally weatherproof and warm. Aiyana had woven together strands of Mary's hair with his own, creating a braided cord that represented marriage bonds in Apache tradition, a private ceremony that acknowledged what had grown between them during weeks of shared labor and gradually deepening trust. Mary accepted the hair ribbon ceremony with full understanding of its significance. She was choosing to marry this Apache warrior in the eyes of his people, even though her own society would never recognize or approve of such a union. The house they had built together would shelter not just their individual survival, but their partnership through whatever challenges lay ahead. "We are married now in Apache way," Aiyana explained as he tied the braided cord around Mary's wrist. "This means we promise to protect each other, share what we have, face troubles together instead of alone." Mary studied the cord on her wrist, understanding that it represented commitment deeper than legal documents or social approval. "What about Christian marriage? What would that mean to you?" Aiyana considered the question seriously. "If Christian marriage important to you, we find way to do that too. But maybe better we keep our marriage private until we know how world respond to Apache man and white woman, choosing love over hatred." Their wedding night was gentle and careful, both of them aware that they were creating something that had never existed before in either of their worlds. Mary found herself grateful for Aiyana's patience and tenderness, his understanding that intimacy required emotional safety as much as physical attraction. The morning after their private wedding, they woke to find cavalry patrol smoke rising from the eastern hills, a sign that the outside world was beginning to intrude on the isolated paradise they had created during weeks of building together. Mary felt fear grip her heart as she realized their time of peaceful cooperation was about to be tested by forces neither of them could control. The brass cavalry button Aiyana found near their property line that afternoon confirmed her worst suspicions. Soldiers had been searching the area, probably looking for signs of Apache activity or investigating reports of unusual activity near the site of the raid that had killed her family. "They're getting closer," Mary observed unnecessarily as they examined the button by lamplight. "Yes," Aiyana agreed grimly. "Cavalry patrols increase and fall before winter make travel difficult. They look for Apache camps to attack, trails to follow, any sign that we still live in this territory they want to claim completely." The discovery of military presence nearby forced them to confront questions they had been avoiding since their partnership began. How long could they maintain their secret?
What would happen when soldiers inevitably discovered the widow everyone assumed had died in the raid was actually living quite comfortably with an Apache warrior who's actually living quite comfortably with an Apache warrior who should have been their enemy? Maybe I should go to town, Mary suggested reluctantly. Show myself, let people know I survived, come up with some story that explains how I made it through alone. Aiyana understood her reasoning, while recognizing the complications such a plan would create. If you go to town, people ask many question that how her widow woman survive Apache raid, build good house, stay alive through difficult time. Your answers must be very clever, or they start wondering who really helped you.
The brass button seemed to catch the firelight ominously as they considered their limited options. Mary had hoped they could remain hidden until spring brought easier travel, and perhaps opportunities to relocate somewhere their partnership wouldn't attract hostile attention. But winter was arriving early, and the military presence suggested that discovery was becoming more likely with each passing day. That night, as they lay together in their completed house, both understood that their honeymoon period was ending. The world that had rejected them both was closing in, and soon they would have to choose between maintaining their love in secret or defending it against societies that viewed their union as impossible at best, treasonous at worst. The sound of the distant church bell reached them on the morning wind. 3 days later, its bronze voice carrying across the desert to announce Sunday services in Cedar Ridge. Mary hadn't heard that bell since before the raid, and its familiar toll awakened memories of the life she had lived before tragedy, and unlikely love had transformed her into someone her former neighbors would barely recognize. "I have to go to town," she told Aiyana as they shared breakfast in their warm kitchen. "People will be wondering what happened to me. If I don't show myself soon, they might organize search parties or send officials to investigate." Aiyana nodded reluctantly, understanding the necessity while fearing the consequences of renewed contact with the white community that had probably written her off as another casualty of Apache violence. "What will you tell them about how you survive?" Mary had been rehearsing her story during sleepless hours, crafting explanations that would satisfy curiosity without revealing the truth about her unlikely partnership. "I'll say I hid in the root cellar during the raid, that I was unconscious when they searched the house and assumed I was dead. I'll tell them I've been living on stored food and what I could gather or hunt, that I rebuilt parts of the house using salvaged materials and techniques Thomas taught me." The lies came easily, but Mary felt them weighing on her conscience like physical burdens. She had never been comfortable with deception, and spinning elaborate falsehoods to protect Aiyana felt like betraying the honesty that had made their partnership so strong. "People in town, they will want to help widow woman who survives such terrible things," Aiyana warned. "They will insist you come live where they can watch over you, protect you from more Apache raids. Hard to refuse such help without making them suspicious." Mary understood the trap she was walking into, but saw no alternative that didn't involve greater risks for both of them. "I'll tell them I can't abandon my husband's grave, that I need to stay near Thomas and Daniel to feel close to them. People understand grief, they might respect my wishes to remain here." The plan felt flimsy when spoken aloud, but it was the best solution they could devise under circumstances that offered no perfect choices. Mary's journey to Cedar Ridge took most of the morning, riding Thomas's horse, which had wandered back to their property several weeks earlier. The familiar rhythm of travel toward town awakened memories of happier times when such trips had been social occasions rather than exercises in deception and survival. The town had grown since her last visit, with new buildings and faces that reflected the steady stream of settlers still arriving despite the ongoing conflicts with Apache tribes. But the core community remained unchanged. Familiar faces, familiar routines, familiar assumptions about how life should be lived on the dangerous frontier. Reverend Matthews was the first to notice her arrival, his face registering shock and joy in equal measure as he recognized the woman everyone had assumed was dead. "Mary Caldwell, dear Lord, we thought you were killed with Thomas and Daniel. Where have you been?" How did you survive? The questions came in a rush, accompanied by genuine emotion that made Mary feel guilty about the deceptions she was about to practice. Reverend Matthews had officiated at her wedding, baptized Daniel, and provided comfort during the difficult early years of their marriage. He deserved better than lies. I hid in the root cellar when I heard the raiders coming, Mary began, delivering her rehearsed explanation with what she hoped was convincing detail. I must have struck my head when I fell down the ladder, because I don't remember much after that. When I came to, the house was burning, and I could hear voices, but they were speaking Apache, so I stayed hidden until they left. Sheriff Collins appeared as word of her survival spread through the town's main street. His questions were more pointed than the Reverend's, focused on tactical details that might help him understand Apache raiding patterns or track the war party responsible for the attack. How many warriors were there? Which direction did they go when they left? Did you recognize any of them, or notice anything distinctive about their weapons or horses? Mary answered as vaguely as possible, claiming that shock and injury had clouded her memories of specific details. But Sheriff Collins pressed harder, clearly suspicious about aspects of her story that didn't align with his experience of Apache raid tactics. They didn't search the root cellar? That's unusual. Apache are thorough about checking hiding places, especially when they know children might be present. Maybe they thought the falling beam had sealed the entrance, Mary suggested. Or maybe they were in a hurry to get away before anyone could track them. The sheriff's expression suggested he remained unconvinced, but before he could ask more probing questions, Margaret Collins arrived with the warm enthusiasm of a woman eager to help another woman who had survived terrible tragedy. Mary dear, you look positively gaunt. How have you been feeding yourself all these weeks, and living in that burned cabin? It must have been dreadful. Margaret's genuine concern made Mary feel even worse about deceiving people who clearly cared about her welfare. But she forced herself to continue the charade, knowing that Aiyana's life depended on maintaining their secret. I managed to salvage some supplies from the ruins, and I remembered things Thomas taught me about gathering food from the desert. It hasn't been easy, but I've survived. Well, you can't continue living out there alone, Margaret declared, with the firmness of someone accustomed to organizing solutions for other people's problems. The other raids this season prove that the Apache are still active in that area. You need to come stay in town where we can protect you properly. Mary had anticipated this pressure and prepared her counter-argument carefully. I can't leave Thomas and Daniel's graves unattended. I need to be near them, to take care of their resting place and feel close to their spirits. Surely you can understand that. Margaret's expression softened with sympathy, but her practical concerns remained unchanged. Of course we understand your feelings, dear, but staying out there alone is simply too dangerous. What if the Apache return? What if you get sick or injured with no one to help you? The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with various townspeople offering advice, assistance, and increasingly insistent suggestions that Mary relocate to town for her own safety. She deflected each offer as diplomatically as possible, but could sense growing puzzlement about her determination to remain in such an isolated and dangerous location. When she finally escaped to purchase supplies, Mary realized that her appearance in town had created more problems than it solved. Instead of satisfying people's curiosity about her fate, her survival had raised new questions about how a widow with no frontier experience had managed to rebuild her home and sustain herself through months of isolation. The newspaper vendor handed her a copy of the Cedar Ridge Gazette, with headlines that made her heart sink. Apache raids intensify throughout territory, and military increases patrols in response to savage attacks. The stories described recent conflicts with inflammatory language that portrayed all Apache as bloodthirsty savages, deserving only extermination. Reading such hatred directed toward Aiyana's people made Mary feel sick with guilt and fear.
If townspeople discovered that she had been living peacefully with an Apache warrior, their reactions would likely be violent regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. She completed her purchases quickly and began the journey home, eager to return to the sanctuary she and Aiyana had created away from the hatred and suspicion that seemed to poison every interaction in the white settlements. But as she rode toward their hidden valley, Mary noticed dust clouds on the horizon that suggested mounted travelers moving in her direction. Her heart pounded with the terrible realization that her visit to town might have triggered exactly the kind of investigation she had hoped to prevent. Aiyana was waiting when she arrived, his expression grim as he helped her unload supplies from the packhorse. "Trouble coming?" he asked, reading the worry in her face. "Maybe," Mary admitted. "People were very surprised to see me alive. They asked a lot of questions about how I survived. And I don't think everyone believed my answers. And there's worse news." She showed him the newspaper headlines that described increased Apache raids and military responses. "If soldiers are patrolling more heavily in this area, it's only a matter of time before they discover our house and start wondering how a widow woman managed to build it alone." That evening brought their fears to reality, in the form of visitors. Reverend Matthews, leading a small delegation of concerned townspeople, who had decided to check on Mary's living conditions and offer more persuasive assistance with relocating to town. Mary spotted them approaching, while there was still time to warn Aiyana, who disappeared into the desert, with the practiced stealth of someone whose survival had long depended on avoiding detection. By the time the visitors reached her door, no sign remained of his presence, except for the house itself, which spoke eloquently of skilled construction that exceeded what anyone expected from a grieving widow working alone. "Mary dear," Reverend Matthews began as he dismounted from his horse, "we've come to see how you're managing, and to discuss arrangements for your move to town." "That's very kind, but as I explained earlier, I can't abandon my family's graves." Margaret Collins studied the rebuilt cabin with obvious amazement. "Myra, this house is remarkable. How on earth did you manage such skilled construction work?" The question stuck at the heart of Mary's deception, forcing her to elaborate on lies that were becoming harder to maintain with each promise. "Thomas taught me more than I realized before he died. And necessity is a powerful teacher when you first leave employer by yourself. Even that store where you deal with the ideas, tailing the absolutely failing you got leaving your TV, only the recent freeze lead." But Margaret's husband, Sheriff Colin, here was examining it and scarcely believed. "This chosen way to do like this, teenage.
This joinery work is exceptional, he observed suspiciously. These joints require knowledge and tools that most experienced carpenters would find challenging. You're certain you did all this work yourself? Mary felt panic rising in her chest as the sheriff's questions grew more pointed and his suspicion more obvious. "I had some help from travelers passing through," she improvised desperately. "Mexican workers heading south for the winter. They shared some techniques in exchange for meals and shelter." "What travelers?" Sheriff Collins pressed. "When did you see them? What did they look like?" The interrogation was interrupted by the discovery that clearly shattered Mary's carefully constructed story. One of the townsmen exploring the area around the house called out from near the creek. "Sheriff, you need to see this." The group hurried toward the voice, Mary following with growing dread about what evidence of Aiyana's presence might have been uncovered, despite their careful precautions. Wanted posters lay scattered near the water, apparently dropped by someone in haste. The papers bore detailed descriptions and sketched portraits of Apache warriors sought by territorial authorities, with substantial rewards offered for information leading to their capture. Sheriff Collins examined the posters with growing excitement, clearly believing he had discovered proof of the Apache presence he had suspected, since Mary's story failed to convince him completely. "These posters are recent," he announced. "Someone has been here within the past few days, probably scouting the area or meeting with Confederates. Mary, you're in immediate danger from hostile Apache who know about your presence here." Mary's heart pounded as she recognized one of the sketched faces on the wanted posters, a crude but recognizable portrait of Aiyana, labeled as a renegade Apache warrior with a substantial bounty offered for his capture, dead or alive. "I've never seen these papers before," she said truthfully, though she suspected Aiyana had been carrying them as intelligence about the military hunt for Apache fugitives. "That settles it," Margaret Collins declared firmly. "You're coming to town with us tonight. We can't leave you here, knowing that dangerous Apache are operating in this area." Mary realized that her options had narrowed to the point where continued resistance would only increase suspicion about her real situation. If she refused to accompany them now, Sheriff Collins would almost certainly organize a search of the area that would inevitably discover evidence of Aiyana's presence. "Let me gather some personal items," she requested, hoping for a few minutes alone to warn Aiyana about the discovery and the increased danger it represented. But Sheriff Collins shook his head firmly. "We'll send men back tomorrow to collect whatever you need. Right now, the priority is getting you to safety before dark brings more Apache activity to this area." As the delegation prepared to escort her to town, Mary caught a glimpse of movement in the rocks above their valley, Aiyana watching from concealment as the white settlers prepared to take her away from the home they had built together. She couldn't signal to him without revealing their partnership, but she hoped he understood that she wasn't leaving by choice. The ride to Cedar Ridge felt like a funeral procession, carrying her away from everything that had given her life meaning since the raid destroyed her original family. Behind them, their house stood empty and vulnerable, filled with evidence of their partnership that would condemn them both if discovered by the wrong people. Sheriff Collins rode beside her, continuing his interrogation about Apache activity in the area and her knowledge of potential threats to other settlers. "If you've seen any signs of hostile Indians' tracks, campsites, smoke signals, you need to report them immediately. The territorial governor has authorized increased military action against Apache bands, and we need all available intelligence to protect innocent families from savage attacks." Mary nodded without speaking, understanding that she was now trapped between worlds in ways that made deception both necessary and increasingly impossible to maintain. The wanted poster bearing Aiyana's likeness rode in Sheriff Collins' saddlebag like a death sentence waiting to be executed. In town, Margaret Collins installed Mary in the boarding house with firm instructions about staying indoors and avoiding any activity that might attract attention from Apache scouts who could be watching the settlement. "Tomorrow we'll organize a proper search of your property to ensure it's safe," Margaret explained, "and we'll discuss permanent arrangements for your future. A young widow like you shouldn't be living alone in such dangerous territory." That night, Mary lay awake in an unfamiliar bed, staring at ceiling boards that reminded her of the logs she and Aiyana had raised together during weeks of shared labor and growing love. Somewhere in the desert, he was probably wondering if she would return or if their partnership had ended with her forced removal to town. The next morning brought news that confirmed her worst fears. A search party led by Sheriff Collins had found clear evidence of Apache presence at her property, tracks, campsites, and other signs that proved hostile Indians had been using the area as a base for raiding activities. The construction work was obviously done by Apache labor, Sheriff Collins announced at the town meeting, called to discuss the security implications of his discoveries. They probably forced Mrs. Caldwell to help them build a stronghold, then planned to use her as a hostage or worse. Mary listened in horror as the sheriff's interpretation of events transformed her love story into a tale of captivity and coercion. The house she and Aiyana had built together became evidence of Apache treachery, their partnership recast as proof of savage cunningness and white vulnerability. "We need to organize a manhunt immediately," Sheriff Collins declared. "These Apache have been operating in our territory for weeks, probably planning coordinated attacks on other settlements. Mrs. Caldwell is lucky to have escaped with her life." The town newspaper ran the story the next morning, with headlines that made Mary's blood run cold. Apache stronghold discovered near Cedar Ridge, and widow woman escapes savage captivity. The articles described her as a victim rather than a willing participant, but they also contained enough accurate details about her property and the construction work to make her realize that returning home might be impossible. 3 days of forced residence in town convinced Mary that she faced an impossible choice between maintaining her safety through continued deception or risking everything to protect the man she had come to love more than her own security. The decision was made for her when Margaret Collins burst into her boarding house room with news that would change everything. "Mary dear, the most wonderful development. A reward has been posted for information about the Apache who held you captive. Sheriff Collins says the bounty is substantial enough to ensure your financial security for years to come." Mary's hands trembled as Margaret showed her the official wanted poster bearing Aiyana's portrait and offering $500 for his capture. The description labeled him as extremely dangerous and wanted dead or alive for multiple murders and raids against innocent settlers. "All you need to do is provide details about his appearance and habits," Margaret continued enthusiastically. "Where he camped, what weapons he carried, any information that might help the army track him down. Think of the justice for Thomas and Daniel, and the security for other families threatened by such savages." The moment Mary had been dreading since their partnership began had finally arrived. She could provide the information that would lead to Aiyana's death and receive enough money to live comfortably anywhere she chose.
Her former neighbors would praise her cooperation, her future would be secure, and she would be welcomed back into the society she had been raised to value above all else. Or she could refuse to betray the man who had saved her life, built her a home, and loved her with a gentleness she had never expected from someone her world had taught her to fear. "I need time to think," Mary said carefully. "The memories are still very painful. Could we discuss this tomorrow?" Margaret agreed reluctantly, clearly eager to see justice done, but willing to respect Mary's emotional needs. But as she left, Mary understood that tomorrow would bring renewed pressure to cooperate with the manhunt, and that her continued refusal would eventually raise questions about her loyalty and truthfulness. That evening, Reverend Matthews visited with what he presented as pastoral counseling, but which felt more like interrogation about her spiritual response to her ordeal. "Sometimes victims of savage violence feel misplaced sympathy for their captors," he explained gently. "It's a natural response to trauma, but one that can prevent proper healing and justice. You must remember that these Apache are enemies of Christian civilization, Mary. Helping to capture them is both your civic duty and your moral obligation." Mary listened to his speech about duty and morality, while thinking about Aiyana's hands weaving the prayer stick to honor her Presbyterian family, his patient teaching about desert survival, the careful way he had respected her grief and helped her transform it into something that could coexist with hope for the future. "What if the Apache wasn't evil?" she asked quietly. "What if he was just trying to survive, like I was?" Reverend Matthews's expression hardened with the certainty of someone whose worldview could not accommodate such moral complexity. "Evil is evil, Mary. The savage who killed your family was evil. Any Apache who would take advantage of a Christian woman's vulnerability is evil. Your confusion about this proves how deeply their corrupted influence has affected your thinking." The conversation convinced Mary that her former community would never understand or accept the truth about her relationship with Aiyana. They had already decided that any Apache must be evil by definition, and any white woman who suggested otherwise must be either corrupted or deluded. But Thomas's wedding ring still hung on a chain around her neck, and late that night she made a decision that would shock everyone who thought they knew Mary Caldwell. She slipped out of the boarding house in the hours before dawn and began the journey back to her property, determined to warn Aiyana about the manhunt and help him escape before the army could organize a coordinated search of the territory. The house stood empty when she arrived,
But she could sense Aiyana's recent presence in small details that only she would recognize: disturbed dust patterns, a cup positioned differently than she had left it, the faint scent of sage smoke from ceremonies she had learned to associate with his morning rituals. She called his name softly, knowing he would be hidden somewhere nearby, but afraid to attract attention from any patrols that might be watching the area. "Aiyana, please, I need to talk to you. There's danger coming that you need to know about." He emerged from concealment, like a shadow becoming solid, his face marked by days of worry about her safety and uncertainty about their future together. "Mary Caldwell," he said formally, using the distance of her full name to acknowledge the changed circumstances that had separated them. "You should not have come back here. Too dangerous for you now." "It's dangerous for both of us," Mary replied, pulling the wanted poster from her coat and showing him his own portrait, staring back from the official document. "They're offering $500 for your capture. The whole territory will be hunting you within days." Aiyana examined the poster with the calm acceptance of someone who had been expecting such developments since his exile began. "You could claim this bounty," he observed quietly. "Tell them where to find me, how to track my movements. $500 buy you good life in any town you choose." "Is that what you think of me?" Mary asked, hurt by his suggestion, despite understanding the logic that prompted it. "That I would sell you for money after everything we've shared?" Aiyana met her gaze directly, his dark eyes reflecting something that might have been hope struggling against, learned caution about trusting anyone in circumstances where betrayal meant death. "I think you are white woman who must live in white world when this adventure ends. I think you deserve chance for normal life with people who accept you, instead of hiding in desert with Apache exile who can offer you nothing but danger and loneliness." Mary stepped closer, close enough to take his hands in hers and feel the calluses they had both earned during weeks of building their home together. "You're wrong about what you can offer me," she said firmly. "You've already given me more than I ever expected to find after losing Thomas and Daniel. You gave me a reason to keep living when I wanted to die. You helped me build not just a house, but a life that means something again." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their reunion, forcing them to make immediate decisions about flight or concealment. Through the morning haze, they could see a substantial cavalry patrol approaching their valley, moving with the systematic precision of a military search operation. "Too late to run," Aiyana observed calmly, assessing their tactical situation with the analytical mind of a warrior who had survived many similar predicaments. "They will see tracks follow us into desert where they have advantages of numbers and horses." Mary understood that their moment of choice had arrived sooner than either had expected. In minutes, soldiers would surround their home and discover evidence of their partnership. She could claim to be a victim and hope they would believe her protestations of innocence, or she could make a choice that would define the rest of her life. The cavalry patrol was close enough now that she could see individual faces. Lieutenant Collins leading a dozen mounted soldiers toward the showdown that would determine whether lava fear would triumph in this isolated corner of Arizona territory. "Mary," Lieutenant Collins called as his patrol reached the clearing where their house stood. "Thank God you're safe. When we found you missing from town, we feared the Apache had taken you again." Mary stepped into the open, positioning herself between the soldiers and the house, where Aiyana waited with whatever dignity a doomed man could maintain in his final moments of freedom. "I came back to collect some personal items," she explained, her voice carrying steadier than she felt. "I needed things that belonged to Thomas and Daniel." Lieutenant Collins dismounted and approached her with the protective concern of someone who believed he was rescuing a victim from renewed captivity. "We'll escort you back to town immediately," he declared. "Our scouts report fresh Apache sign all around this area. The savage who held you prisoner is still operating in this territory, and it's not safe for you here." "He's not a savage," Mary said quietly, her words carrying across the clearing with the clarity of someone who had finally decided to speak truth, regardless of consequences. The statement struck the cavalry patrol like a thunderclap, creating a moment of stunned silence while Lieutenant Collins processed what he had just heard. "Excuse me? Did you just defend the Apache who killed your family and held you captive?" Mary looked toward the house where her husband had built and where she and Aiyana had rebuilt, understanding that her next words would seal both their fates. "Aiyana didn't kill my family," she said clearly. "He saved my life when I was dying of grief and starvation. He helped me build this house, taught me how to survive, and treated me with more respect and kindness than I'm receiving from the people who claim to be protecting me." Lieutenant Collins stared at her with growing comprehension of what her words implied. "Are you telling me you've been cooperating willingly with a hostile Apache warrior?" "I'm telling you that I've been living with my husband," Mary replied, removing Thomas's wedding ring from the chain around her neck and dropping it deliberately into the dust between them. "Aiyana is not my captor. He's the man I chose to marry when I realized that love matters more than the hatred that's poisoning this territory." The admission created chaos among the cavalry patrol, with soldiers raising weapons and shouting contradictory orders, while Lieutenant Collins struggled to maintain control of a situation that had exceeded all his expectations. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the house immediately," he commanded. "If there's a hostile Indian inside, you're in mortal danger, regardless of what you think about your relationship with him. The only danger here is what you've brought with you," Mary replied firmly. "Aiyana could have killed me dozens of times if that had been his intention. Instead, he's spent months protecting me and helping me heal from the loss of everything I thought my life was supposed to be." Aiyana appeared in the doorway of their house, moving slowly with his hands visible to demonstrate that he posed no immediate threat to the soldiers who surrounded him. His dignity in the face of certain death struck Mary as the most courageous thing she had ever witnessed. "I am Aiyana," he said in careful English, addressing Lieutenant Collins directly. "I am the Apache you seek. This woman tell truth. I am her husband by choice, not by force." Lieutenant Collins found himself facing a situation that military training had never prepared him to handle. His orders were to capture or kill hostile Apache warriors, but this Apache claimed to be married to a white woman who defended him publicly and seemed genuinely devoted to his welfare. "Ma'am, you need to understand that this man is wanted for multiple murders and raids against innocent settlers," the lieutenant explained patiently. "Whatever he's told you about his past, whatever relationship you think you have with him, he's a dangerous criminal who's deceived you about his true nature." Mary stepped closer to Aiyana, taking his hand in hers with a gesture that declared her allegiance more clearly than any words could have conveyed. "Then you'll have to arrest me too," she said calmly, "because I've been harboring a fugitive, aiding an enemy of the territorial government, and committing treason against my own people. If he's guilty of crimes, then so am I." The standoff stretched across several minutes, while Lieutenant Collins weighed his options and considered the political implications of arresting a white woman for defending her Apache husband. The situation exceeded his authority to resolve, but he couldn't simply withdraw and leave a wanted criminal free to continue operating in the territory. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said finally, "I'm placing both of you under arrest, pending investigation by territorial authorities. You'll be transported to Fort Whipple for questioning and legal proceedings." As soldiers moved forward to bind their hands, Mary felt a strange sense of peace settling over her despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had made her choice openly and honestly, choosing love over safety and truth over the deceptions that had been slowly poisoning her soul. The ride to Fort Whipple took 2 days, with Mary and Aiyana traveling under heavy guard, but treated with the courtesy due to prisoners whose case required careful legal consideration. Lieutenant Collins clearly remained puzzled by Mary's willing cooperation with his arrest procedures and her continued insistence that her marriage to Aiyana represented a free choice rather than the result of coercion or Stockholm Syndrome. At the fort, they were separated for individual interrogation by Colin Harrison, The post commander, whose responsibility included determining whether Mary should be charged as a criminal or treated as a victim requiring medical attention for psychological trauma. Mrs. Caldwell, Colonel Harrison began his interview. I want you to understand that no one holds you responsible for whatever you may have done while under duress from your Apache captor. Survival sometimes requires cooperation with our enemies, and the territorial government recognizes that victims of savage violence cannot be blamed for actions taken under extreme coercion. Mary appreciated his attempt at kindness, while recognizing the assumptions that made his compassion irrelevant to her actual situation. Colonel, I was never under duress from Aiyana. I married him because I love him, and because he proved himself to be a better man than many of those who share my race and religion. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to process Mary's continued insistence on defending her Apache husband, despite being offered multiple opportunities to reclaim victim status and social acceptance. Ma'am, perhaps you don't fully understand the legal implications of what you're saying. If you persist in claiming that your relationship with this Apache was voluntary, you could face charges of treason, providing aid and comfort to enemies of the United States, and violating territorial laws against miscegenation. I understand perfectly, Mary replied, and I'm prepared to face those charges rather than lie about the man who saved my life and taught me that love is stronger than the hatred that's destroying this territory. The colonel's questions continued for several hours, covering every aspect of her relationship with Aiyana and her understanding of the legal consequences she faced. But Mary's answers remained consistent. She had chosen to marry Aiyana freely. She considered him her husband under both Apache and Christian law, and she was prepared to accept whatever punishment territorial authorities deemed appropriate for her choices. Meanwhile, Aiyana faced his own interrogation by military intelligence officers, seeking information about Apache raiding parties, tribal politics, and strategic intelligence that might help the Army's campaign against hostile Indians throughout the Southwest. You can help yourself considerably by cooperating with our investigation, Captain Reynolds explained. Information about Apache movements, leadership and military capabilities could earn you clemency or at least consideration for transportation to a reservation rather than execution. Aiyana listened politely to the offer, while understanding that no amount of cooperation would truly change his fate. Military authorities needed to make an example of an Apache warrior who had dared to marry a white woman, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. I have no information about Apache war parties, he replied. Truthfully, I have been exiled from my people for many moons, living alone until I meet Mary Caldwell and choose to help her survive. Captain Reynolds pressed for details about tribal activities, but Aiyana's exile had indeed separated him from intelligence that might be valuable to military planners. His knowledge concerned healing arts and construction techniques, rather than military tactics or raiding strategies. After 3 days of interrogation, Colonel Harrison faced the unprecedented situation of an Apache warrior and white woman who openly acknowledged their marriage and refused to characterize their relationship as anything other than a love story that transcended racial boundaries. The legal precedents were unclear, the political implications were complex, and the social ramifications extended far beyond military jurisdiction. Harrison found himself consulting with territorial officials, legal experts, and even Washington authorities about how to handle a case that challenged fundamental assumptions about race relations on the frontier. The solution, when it finally emerged, satisfied no one completely, but avoided the most dangerous political consequences of either execution or complete exoneration. Mary and Aiyana would be exiled from Arizona territory, forbidden to return under penalty of immediate arrest and prosecution. They would be escorted to the territorial boundary and released with minimal supplies and a warning that any attempt to return would result in their execution without further legal proceedings. This is the most lenient sentence possible, given the severity of the charges, Colonel Harrison explained as he announced their fate. The territorial government cannot officially recognize marriages between whites and Indians, but neither can we execute people whose only crime appears to be falling in love across racial boundaries. Exile meant abandoning the house they had built together, leaving the graves of Thomas and Daniel, and starting over in unfamiliar territory without resources or community support. But it also meant remaining together, free to build whatever kind of life their love could sustain, without the constant threat of legal persecution. 2 weeks later, they crossed the territorial boundary into New Mexico, carrying only the clothes on their backs and the compass Margaret Collins had secretly provided as a farewell gift from the few townspeople who had come to respect Mary's courage, if not her choices. The compass pointed toward their uncertain future, as surely as their shared commitment pointed toward whatever challenges lay ahead in territories where their love might find more acceptance, or at least less active persecution. They established their new home in an abandoned mining claim, high in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the previous owner's cabin provided basic shelter while they worked to create sustainable lives, far from the societies that had rejected their partnership. Aiyana's knowledge of mountain survival proved as valuable as his desert wisdom had been, while Mary's domestic skills helped them establish routines that transformed mere survival into something approaching comfortable living. The isolation that had been punishment in Arizona became blessing in New Mexico, providing space for their love to grow without external pressure or judgment. Their first winter together as exiles tested every survival skill they had learned, but it also strengthened their partnership in ways that prosperity might never have achieved. When spring arrived, they had proved to themselves that their love could survive anything the world might throw at them. Word reached them in their second year of exile that the charges against them had been quietly dropped under a territorial amnesty program for Indians who had avoided hostile activities during a particularly brutal period of warfare. Aiyana's name had been cleared of the murder charges that had made him a wanted man, and Mary's cooperation with authorities had been officially recognized as valuable intelligence gathering, rather than treason. "We could go back," Mary said, as she read the official pardon that had been forwarded through a complex network of contacts who remembered their story. "We could return to Arizona, rebuild our house, start over where we began." Aiyana considered the possibility while watching their first child take uncertain steps around the cabin they had built with their own hands in the mountains that had become their sanctuary. "What do you think, Mary Caldwell, who became Mary Aiyana?" he asked, using the name that reflected her adoption into his family traditions. "Do we go back to a place where people know our story, or do we stay where we make new story without anyone watching?" Mary looked around their mountain home.
Their daughter was born the following spring, delivered with Aiyana's gentle skill and welcomed into a world where Apache and white traditions blended seamlessly in daily routines that honored both heritage equally. The child would grow up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable with differences that her parents' generation had been taught to fear. More families began settling in their remote valley over the years, other couples whose love had crossed racial or cultural boundaries, former soldiers who had grown tired of warfare, settlers seeking communities based on mutual support rather than shared prejudices. Mary and Aiyana found themselves unofficial leaders of a settlement that proved integration was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict. The trading post they established served travelers from many backgrounds, offering supplies and news, while demonstrating that Apache and white proprietors could work together successfully. Their reputation for fair dealing and genuine hospitality spread throughout the region, attracting customers who might never have considered doing business with an integrated establishment in other circumstances. Years passed quietly, marked by children's birthdays, seasonal celebrations that combined traditions from both cultures, and the gradual expansion of their community into something that resembled the peaceful coexistence most people claimed was impossible between whites and Indians.
Mary's hair turned grey while raising children who spoke English and Apache with equal fluency, who learned construction techniques from their father and reading skills from their mother, who saw diversity as natural rather than threatening because their earliest experiences had taught them that differences could enhance rather than destroy community harmony. On the 10th anniversary of their exile from Arizona Territory, they returned for the first time to visit Thomas and Daniel's graves and see what had become of the house they had built together during those desperate weeks when survival had seemed impossible. The structure still stood, weathered but sound, occupied now by a Mexican family whose patriarch thanked them effusively for the solid construction that had provided his own family with reliable shelter through several difficult seasons. "Whoever built this house," Miguel Santos explained, "they know how to work with desert, not against it. My children, they grow up safe because of good walls and strong roof." Mary and Aiyana exchanged glances that carried 10 years of shared history, understanding that their original home had indeed served its purpose by sheltering love and protecting life, even if not in ways they had originally envisioned. At the graves of Thomas and Daniel, Mary placed wildflowers while Aiyana offered Apache prayers for the spirits of those who had died, protecting their loved ones. Their children played nearby, unconscious of the tragedy that had brought their parents together, but somehow absorbing the reverence their parents showed for this place where love had conquered loss. "Do you ever regret it?" Mary asked as they prepared to return to their mountain home. "Helping me when you could have kept traveling toward Mexico, choosing love when it meant exile and hardship." Aiyana studied the house where they had discovered that two people from enemy cultures could build something beautiful together, then looked at the children who represented proof that love could indeed bridge any divide that hatred might create. "Never," he said simply. "Every choice that brought us together was right choice, even when it seemed impossible or dangerous. My grandmother used to say that spirits sometimes guide us toward our true destiny by making easy paths impossible and forcing us to walk difficult roads that lead to unexpected blessings." The child's cradle that Aiyana had carved sat in their mountain cabin, waiting for the grandchildren who would continue the story of love, transcending boundaries that their own courage had begun. Each tiny detail of its construction reflected the same patient care they had brought to building their first house together. Attention to beauty as well as function, respect for materials and traditions, hope for futures that would justify present sacrifices. Their trading post had become a stop on informal networks that connected communities throughout the Southwest, carrying news and goods, but also stories about places where different peoples lived together peacefully. The example they had set in their remote valley inspired other experiments in integration, proving that the hatred consuming most of the frontier represented choice, rather than inevitability. Mary often stood on their porch at sunset, watching the light fade over mountains that had sheltered their love through its most vulnerable years. The compass Margaret Collins had given them still pointed reliably in whatever direction they needed to travel, but increasingly they found that home was not a destination, but a state of being they had created, through choosing each other repeatedly, day after day, year after year. Letters arrived occasionally from Arizona Territory, carrying news of continued conflicts, but also reports of gradual changes in attitudes toward Indians, who demonstrated willingness to live peacefully alongside white settlers. Mary's public defense of Aiyana had become part of local folklore, inspiring other women to question assumptions about racial differences and the possibilities for cooperation rather than eternal warfare. The wooden toy horse that had belonged to Daniel found a place of honor in their children's collection, carefully preserved as a reminder that love could survive even the most devastating losses. New toys surrounded it, Apache dolls, Mexican puzzle boxes, items that reflected the multicultural community their courage had helped create in the mountains of New Mexico. As Mary approached her 60th birthday, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from grieving widow to matriarch of an integrated community that proved daily that understanding was possible between peoples who had been taught to see each other
only as enemies. The house she and Aiyana had built with their own hands in Arizona had been just the beginning, a symbol of what two people could create when they chose love over fear, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair. Everything that had grown from that foundation represented proof that the human heart was strong enough to bridge any divide that history or prejudice might create. The story of what Mary did next, the choice that had shocked everyone who knew her, had become legend throughout the Southwest, carried by traders and travelers who understood that some actions changed not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of what was possible between different peoples. Standing beside Aiyana as they watched their grandchildren play in the garden they had planted together, Mary understood that her shocking decision to defend love over social acceptance had indeed changed everything, creating ripples that would continue spreading long after their own story reached its natural conclusion. The desert wind that had once carried only war cries and hatred now whispered stories of families where Apache and white, Mexican and Anglo, all manner of peoples had learned to build homes together based on mutual respect and shared dreams for their children's futures. What she had done next, when the moment of choice arrived, was choose love. And in choosing love, she had discovered that individual courage could indeed change the world, one relationship at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, until the impossible became not just possible, but natural, normal, and as enduring as the mountains that sheltered the life they had built together, from the ashes of tragedy and the courage to believe in better possibilities.
In the harsh wilderness of 1870s Arizona territory, Mary Caldwell kneels beside the charred remains of what was once her cabin, her husband and young son buried beneath the collapsed timber. The Apache raid took everything, her family, her home, her future. With winter approaching and the nearest settlement 3 days' ride away, death seems certain. Then Aiyana appears like a shadow against the desert sunset. Cast out from his own people for reasons he won't explain, this Apache warrior carries the same haunted look that Mary sees in her own reflection. When he offers to help rebuild her home, she faces a decision that could mean survival or destruction. Their unlikely partnership creates something neither expected, a bond that transcends the hatred consuming the frontier. But when the townspeople discover what Mary has done, will she choose the safety of acceptance or stand by the man who gave her back her life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mary's fingers trembled as she pulled the charred wedding ring from the ashes, its gold band blackened but somehow unbroken, despite the flames that had consumed everything else she held dear. 3 days had passed since the Apache raid destroyed her world, yet this simple circle of metal had survived, as if refusing to let her forget what love looked like when it was pure and uncomplicated. The wooden toy horse lay half-buried nearby, its carved mane singed but still recognizable. 6-year-old Daniel had clutched it during their final moments together, his small fingers wrapped around the familiar comfort, while terror raged outside their root cellar. Thomas had carved that horse during the long winter evenings, his weathered hands shaping each detail with the patient love of a father who wanted to give his son something that would last forever. Now both the horse and the man who carved it existed only in memory. Mary could still hear Thomas's voice from that final morning, calling over his shoulder as he rode out to check their small herd of cattle. "I'll be back by sunset, darling. Found some wild honey in that old oak by the creek. Tonight we'll have a feast that'll make Daniel think he's died and gone to heaven." Daniel had been so excited about the promised honey that he'd barely touched his breakfast, instead galloping his wooden horse around the kitchen table while planning all the ways they might use the sweet treasure. "Can we make honey cakes, Mama? Can we put honey in the cornbread? Can we save some for when the baby comes? The baby that would never come now." Mary touched her still flat belly, where new life had been growing for barely 2 months. a secret she and Thomas had shared with shy smiles and whispered plans. The raid had taken even that hope, leaving her empty in ways that went beyond the simple absence of family. She had been kneading bread when the first war cries shattered the peaceful afternoon. Through the kitchen window, she watched painted warriors thunder toward their homestead, the sound of unshod hooves mixing with her own screaming. Thomas was 2 miles away with the cattle, too far to help, too far to even know what was happening to his family, until it was all over. "Daniel, come away from the window," she had called, but her son stood frozen, wooden horse pressed against his chest, watching death approach with the terrible fascination of childhood. The first arrow struck their door as she grabbed him, pulling him toward the root cellar Thomas had dug for storing winter vegetables. The memories after that blurred together like images seen through smoke and tears. Flames climbing the walls, the crack of burning timber. Daniel's small body pressed against hers in the darkness below ground, while his breathing gradually grew shallow and still. The terrible silence when the raiders finally left, broken only by the hungry roar of fire consuming the home they had built together, log by careful log, over 3 years of hope and hard work. She had waited in that cellar until the flames died, holding Daniel's lifeless form and listening to the house collapse above them. When she finally emerged, she found Thomas's horse wandering riderless near the creek, its flanks bearing arrow wounds that told the story of her husband's final desperate ride home. His body lay a 1/4 mile from the house, surrounded by scattered cattle and 3 dead Apache warriors. Even outnumbered and surprised, Thomas had fought with the fierce determination of a man trying to reach his family. The wild honey he had promised Daniel lay spilled in the dirt beside him, the wooden bucket shattered by a war club that had failed to stop his charge. 3 graves now marked what remained of the Caldwell homestead. Thomas beneath the oak tree, where he had promised to find sweetness for their son. Daniel beside his father, the wooden horse buried with him, as companion for whatever journey lay ahead. The 3rd grave, unmarked and shallow, held the dreams Mary had carried for their growing family, dreams that had died with the first war cry. For 3 days she had survived on stream water, and the few edible roots Thomas had taught her to recognize during their first difficult season in Arizona territory. Her hands bore fresh burns from digging through the wreckage, her dress was torn and smoke-stained, and her body grew weaker with each passing hour. The nearest settlement lay 3 days' ride to the south, across terrain she had traveled only twice before, both times guided by Thomas's steady knowledge of landmarks and water sources. Winter was coming. She could feel it in the sharp wind that cut through the canyon each morning, in the way the desert plants had begun to brown and withdraw their life force into hidden roots. The first killing frost would arrive within weeks, and after that, the snows that made travel impossible until spring. If she was going to reach Cedar Ridge alive, she needed to start walking soon. But something held her beside these graves, some mixture of grief and loyalty that made leaving feel like abandonment. Thomas and Daniel deserved better than a widow who fled at the first sign of hardship. They had died protecting this place, believing it was worth defending. How could she simply walk away from everything they had sacrificed to create? The sun climbed higher, promising another day of desert heat before the cold night fell. Mary studied the ruins of her home, trying to imagine how she might survive here through the coming winter. The foundation stones remained solid, and some of the heavier timbers could be salvaged. Thomas's tools lay scattered but intact in what had been his workshop. With enough determination and luck, perhaps she could build some kind of shelter before the weather turned deadly. But determination alone wouldn't be enough. She lacked the skill to construct anything more substantial than a lean-to, and even that would require help moving the heavier materials. The physical demands of frontier construction had always been Thomas's domain, while she managed the garden, the cooking, and the 1,000 domestic tasks that kept their household running. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the canyon, Mary made her decision. Tomorrow she would begin the journey to Cedar Ridge, carrying what little she could manage and leaving everything else to the desert wind. Better to die walking toward potential safety than to freeze beside the graves of those she couldn't save. But as she prepared to spend one final night beside Thomas and Daniel, a shadow fell across the clearing where their cabin had stood. Mary looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the setting sun, tall, lean and moving, with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape in ways she never would. An Apache warrior, alone and apparently unarmed, watching her from the edge of the desert, with eyes that seemed to understand loss in the same way she was learning to understand it herself. The Apache medicine pouch hung at Aiyana's waist, its leather worn smooth by years of handling and darkened by the sacred herbs his grandmother had blessed before his exile. Inside lay the remnants of his former life, dried plants for healing, a piece of turquoise for protection, and a small bundle of sage that carried prayers he could no longer offer at tribal fires. He had been watching the white woman for 2 days, observing her grief from a distance, while deciding whether her presence represented opportunity or danger. The burned homestead told a story he recognized, another violent encounter between his people and the settlers who continued pushing into Apache lands, seeking farms and futures in territory that had belonged to his ancestors for countless generations. But this woman's mourning struck him as different from the usual aftermath of frontier violence. She tended the graves with reverence, spoke to the dead in soft tones that carried across the canyon, and showed no sign of the hatred that typically consumed survivors of Apache raids. Instead, she seemed crushed by sorrow, rather than hardened by it, broken in ways that reminded him of his own emotional wounds. Aiyana stepped closer, making enough noise to announce his presence without appearing threatening. His exile had taught him to read people quickly and accurately. The difference between suspicion and outright hostility could determine whether a chance encounter ended in conversation or bloodshed. This woman radiated despair rather than aggression, grief rather than rage. Mary's head snapped up at the sound of displaced stones. Terror flooded her chest as she saw the Apache warrior approaching through the twilight, his movements deliberate and controlled. Every story Thomas had ever told her about Apache raids came rushing back, tales of captured women, burned settlements, and the swift brutality of desert warfare. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible through her dry throat. "I have nothing left to take." Aiyana stopped 20 feet away, noting her obvious exhaustion and the way she clutched Daniel's toy horse like a talisman against evil. He could see the burns on her hands, the tears in her dress, and the hollow look of someone who had not eaten properly in days. This woman posed no threat to him or anyone else. She was dying as surely as if she carried arrow wounds. "I no hurt you," he said in the careful English he had learned from Mexican traders and the occasional friendly settler. "See your fire, your graves. Come to understand what happened here." His accent made the words difficult to follow, but Mary caught their general meaning. She studied his face in the fading light, noting the absence of war paint and the way he kept his hands visible and empty of weapons. If he meant immediate harm, surely he would have acted already rather than announcing his presence from a distance. "Are you?" She struggled with the question that might determine her fate. "Were you with the ones who did this?" Aiyana followed her gaze toward the graves and shook his head slowly, understanding her fear while recognizing the tragedy that had befallen her family. "My people, maybe. Not my war party. I walk alone now. No tribe, no war band, just me in the desert." Something in his tone suggested his isolation matched her own. Mary looked more carefully at this unlikely visitor, noting details beyond her initial terror. His clothing showed trail wear, but remained well maintained, suggesting pride despite difficult circumstances. No fresh blood stained his weapons or hands. The medicine pouch at his belt spoke of spiritual beliefs that might value life over needless killing. "Why are you alone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aiyana considered how much truth he could share with someone who had every reason to view all Apache as enemies. The story of his exile was complicated, rooted in choices that had cost him everything he had once valued. But something about this woman's obvious suffering called to the healer his grandmother had tried to train him to be, before war and politics had torn that gentler path from his future. My chief say I bring shame to war party, send me away from people, no more family, no more home for me either. The admission carried weight that Mary recognized despite their language barriers. She had heard the loneliness in his voice, the same hollow quality that echoed in her own words when she spoke to Thomas and Daniel's graves. What kind of shame? Aiyana looked toward the graves where her family rested, then back at her face, marked by loss that transcended cultural boundaries. I refuse to kill white children, old people, women who cannot fight warriors. Chiefs say this make me weak, not worthy of Apache blood. The explanation struck Mary with unexpected force. Here was an Apache warrior who had been exiled for refusing to participate in the kind of raid that had destroyed her own family. The irony felt almost too sharp to bear, like some cosmic jest that brought her face to face with the one man among her enemies who might have tried to prevent her tragedy. So you chose honor over belonging, she observed quietly. I chose what my grandmother teach me was right. Sometimes right choice bring great loneliness. Mary understood that lesson with painful intimacy. Her own choices to remain at her family's gravesite rather than fleeing immediately to town, to listen to this Apache warrior instead of screaming and running, were leading her toward isolation from everything familiar and safe. The desert wind picked up as full darkness settled over the canyon, bringing with it the bitter cold that would make this night another test of survival. Mary shivered in her thin dress, while Aiyana seemed unaffected by the temperature change that would soon become dangerous for someone without proper shelter or warm clothing. You cannot survive winter here alone, Aiyana said, stating the obvious truth they both recognized. Too cold, too little food. Desert kill you before first snow. I know, Mary admitted, surprised by her own willingness to acknowledge her desperate circumstances to someone who should have been her enemy. Tomorrow I start walking to town, 3 days south, if I can find the way. Aiyana considered the difficulties of such a journey for someone in her condition. 3 days through desert terrain without adequate supplies or knowledge of water sources would likely prove fatal, especially as winter weather made travel increasingly treacherous. Town very far. Easy to lose way in desert, die of thirst before you see buildings. The brutal honesty of his assessment confirmed her own fears about attempting the journey alone. But what alternatives remained? She couldn't stay here and slowly starve, and she certainly couldn't expect help from the very people who had destroyed her family. I help you build new house, Aiyana said quietly, the offer emerging from some deep well of compassion that surprised them both. I know how to build strong walls, warm shelter. You need help, or you die here. The proposal hung between them like a bridge, spanning an impossible chasm. Mary stared at this exiled warrior, who spoke of help when his very presence could mean death for both of them if discovered by patrol soldiers or hostile neighbors. Why would you do that for me? Aiyana touched his medicine pouch, drawing strength from the sacred objects that connected him to his grandmother's teachings about the sanctity of life and the obligations of those blessed with healing knowledge. Because everyone deserves chance to live, even when living seem impossible. Because my grandmother teach me that spirits judge us by how we treat those who cannot help themselves. The answer carried sincerity that Mary found herself wanting to believe, despite every rational argument against trusting an Apache warrior. But as the desert cold settled around them, and another night of exposure threatened to drain what little strength she had remaining, trust seemed less important than simple survival. If we did this, she said carefully, if you helped me build shelter, what would you want in return? Food when possible. Warm place to sleep during cold nights. Maybe someone to talk with, who understand what it means to lose everything important. The modest request struck Mary as reasonable, almost generous considering what he offered in return. But accepting his help would mean extended contact with someone her society considered a savage, creating complications that extended far beyond the immediate challenges of construction. As if reading her thoughts, Aiyana added, "I know this bring danger for both of us. White soldiers find Apache man with white woman. They kill first and ask questions later, but winter kill you certain if you have no shelter. With help, maybe you live to see spring." The cold wind seemed to emphasize his point, cutting through her thin dress and reminding her that death by freezing was just as final as death by violence. Mary looked toward the graves where Thomas and Daniel rested, wondering what counsel they might offer about this impossible choice. "I need time to think," she said finally. Aiyana nodded, understanding the magnitude of the decision she faced. "I make small camp by creek. Tomorrow morning you tell me what you decide. If you say no, I continue south to Mexico, and we never see each other again." He melted back into the darkness as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Mary alone with her dead family and a choice that would determine not just her immediate survival, but the kind of person she was willing to become in order to stay alive. Thomas's hammer lay where it had fallen during the raid, thrown clear of the burning cabin by some miracle of physics and flame. Mary lifted the familiar tool at first light, feeling its weight settle into her palm, like an old friend returning home after a long journey. The wooden handle bore scorch marks, but remained solid, the iron head still true, despite the fire that had consumed everything else. She had made her decision during the long, cold night, spent shivering beside the graves. Practical survival outweighed social convention when the choice lay between accepting help from an unlikely source or dying alone in the desert. Thomas would have understood. He had always been a practical man who judged people by their actions rather than their appearance or reputation. Aiyana appeared with the sunrise, approaching from his camp by the creek with the same careful respect he had shown the evening before. He carried nothing threatening, no weapons visible, no war paint, nothing that suggested hostile intentions toward a woman who could offer him little beyond conversation and whatever meager food she might manage to prepare. "You decide," he asked simply, stopping at the same respectful distance he had maintained during their first encounter. "Yes," Mary replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I accept your help. God help us both, but I accept." Aiyana nodded solemnly, understanding the magnitude of her choice and the trust it represented. "We start with clearing burned wood, saving what can be used again. Then we see what materials desert give us for building new walls." Their first full day of partnership began with awkward attempts at communication as they sorted through the wreckage of Mary's former life. Aiyana moved through the debris with systematic efficiency, separating salvageable timber from material fit only for kindling. His knowledge surprised Mary. He understood load-bearing requirements, recognized quality joinery, and spotted structural problems she would never have noticed. "Where did you learn about building?" she asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her lingering wariness. Aiyana paused in his work, considering how much personal history felt safe to share. "Apache learned many skills for survival. We build, we tear down, we understand what make house strong or weak. Also, I watch Mexican builders, white settlers during times of peace. Learn their methods, their mistakes." His explanation carried implications Mary chose not to examine too closely. The same knowledge that helped him identify structural weaknesses could have aided in attacking settlements like hers. But that was before. Whatever had led to his exile had apparently changed everything about his circumstances and loyalties. As they worked together clearing debris, Mary found herself studying Aiyana when she thought he wasn't looking. His movements carried the economy of someone accustomed to making every action count, every decision matter for survival. Yet he showed careful respect for objects that had belonged to her former life, handling Thomas's tools with the same reverence he might show sacred objects in his own culture.
When they uncovered Daniel's wooden horse, partially burned but still recognizable, Aiyana stopped working entirely. He lifted the carved toy with gentle hands, examining the detailed craftsmanship of mane and legs that Thomas had shaped during long winter evenings. "Your boy, he loved this horse very much," Aiyana said softly, speaking more to the toy than to Mary. She nodded, unable to find words around the sudden tightness in her throat. Aiyana studied the horse for a long moment, then carried it carefully to the pile of personal items he had been setting aside. He placed it with the same reverence he might show objects destined for burial with honored dead. "Good father make this," he observed. "Much love in the carving. Boy, carry father's heart with him always." The simple tribute to Thomas's craftsmanship nearly broke Mary's composure. She had spent 3 days seeing only destruction and loss, but Aiyana's recognition of the love embedded in Daniel's toy reminded her that some things survived even the most devastating fires. They worked in companionable silence through the morning, gradually developing wordless communication about lifting, carrying and stacking materials. Mary discovered muscles she had forgotten. She possessed strength that months of domestic routine had left dormant, but not lost. The physical demands of clearing wreckage proved oddly therapeutic, giving her body useful work while her mind processed the strange reality of partnering with someone who should have been her enemy. By midday they had cleared enough space to assess what kind of structure might be possible with available materials. Aiyana walked the old foundation perimeter, testing stones and examining the layout. Thomas had originally designed. "Foundation good," he announced. "Stone solid, drainage proper. We build here again, house stand many winters." His confident assessment of their prospects surprised Mary. She had been thinking in terms of basic shelter, something to keep her alive until spring arrived, and travel became possible again. But Aiyana spoke as if they were planning a real home, a structure meant to last for years, rather than months. "What kind of house?" she asked. Aiyana found a stick and began sketching in the dirt beside the foundation stones. His drawing showed a simple but well-proportioned structure, smaller than the cabin she and Thomas had built, but more sophisticated in its design. "Here main room with fireplace for warmth and cooking," he explained, indicating the central area. "Here sleeping room for privacy, storage here for food and tools. Windows faced east for morning sun, south for winter warmth, when sun is low." Mary studied his sketch, impressed by the thoughtful planning that incorporated both practical needs and comfort considerations.
How long would this take to build? Aiyana considered the question seriously, calculating materials, labor, and weather constraints. "Maybe 6 weeks for walls and roof, if we work hard and weather cooperate. Need to finish before heavy snows come, or we both freeze." The timeline felt both optimistically ambitious and desperately necessary. Mary understood that winter would arrive whether they were prepared or not, and that their survival depended on completing adequate shelter before the first serious storms made construction impossible. "Can we really do this?" she asked, voicing doubts that had been growing throughout the morning. Aiyana met her gaze directly, his dark eyes holding certainty she desperately needed to borrow. "Yes, we do this together. You have good tools from your husband. I have knowledge of building. Together we have what we need to make strong house." Something in his quiet confidence persuaded Mary to trust in possibilities that seemed incredible when she considered them alone. Thomas's hammer felt solid and familiar in her hands, a tangible connection to her husband's skill and determination. Perhaps those qualities could live on through her partnership with this unlikely ally. They spent the afternoon beginning actual construction work, starting with the methodical process of repairing and reinforcing the existing foundation. Aiyana showed Mary how to prepare mortar from local clay, sand and water, mixing the components to achieve the proper consistency for holding stones together through winter freeze and summer heat. Working side by side, they established the rhythm that would carry them through the weeks ahead. Aiyana's knowledge of materials and techniques complemented Mary's familiarity with Thomas's tools and methods. Neither could have managed the project alone, but together they possessed the skills needed to create something that might actually keep them alive. As evening approached and the desert cold began settling over the canyon, they sat beside their small fire, sharing a meal of gathered roots and stream water. The conversation remained limited by language barriers, but Mary found herself appreciating Aiyana's quiet company more than she had expected. "Tomorrow we begin raising walls," Aiyana said, studying their day's progress with satisfaction. "First tunes above foundation, then logs for main structure. Slow work, but each day we make progress." Mary nodded, feeling cautiously optimistic about their prospects for the first time since the raid. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping me, for giving me hope when I thought there was none left." Aiyana poked at their fire with a stick, watching sparks rise into the star-filled sky. "Sometimes hope is all we have when everything else gets taken away. My grandmother used to say that hope is gift from spirits, something they never let our enemies destroy completely." The reference to his grandmother reminded Mary of the medicine pouch at his waist and the spiritual traditions that seemed to guide his actions despite his exile from tribal society. "Will you tell me about her sometime, about why her teachings matter so much to you?" "Someday, maybe," Aiyana replied, "when we know each other better, when trust grows stronger between us. Tonight we rest and prepare for tomorrow's work. Building house is like building friendship, must be done slowly, carefully, one piece at a time." As they prepared for sleep in their separate areas, Mary reflected on the strange turns her life had taken in just 2 days. From widow preparing to die alone, to partner in an impossible construction project with an exiled Apache warrior. Thomas's hammer lay beside her blanket, ready for another day of building something that had never existed before, not just a house, but a bridge between worlds that had been taught to see each other only as enemies. The night wind carried the sound of distant coyotes calling to each other across the desert, their voices weaving patterns of communication that transcended the barriers of language and fear. Perhaps, Mary thought as she drifted towards sleep, she and Aiyana were learning to do something similar, finding ways to build understanding across differences that had once seemed impossible to bridge. The shared water gourd passed between them had become a ritual of sorts, a simple vessel that symbolized